Today marks 6 months also to the day since Nancy Guthrie was kidnapped in her home near Tucson, Arizona. Yesterday, the Pima County Sheriff's Office, which has led the investigation, released a pair of emails they say were sent to the family, and they are treating them as legitimate. Meg Oliver is here with the latest on this absolutely tragic mystery. Meg, good morning.
Adriana, good morning. The Pima County Sheriff's Office says these letters are distinct in style and are hoping the public can help them identify the writer.
6 months is a long time for a mystery to sit in the dark. And when a case stays unresolved that long, every new detail can feel like a clue, a warning, or a trap. That is exactly why investigators have now put 2 messages back in the public eye in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the mother of Today co-host Savannah Guthrie. At first glance, they read like the kind of thing a desperate kidnapper might send. But the more you look at them, the more unsettling they become, because these were not random messages. They were specific, personal, and, in the eyes of investigators, written in a way that might be familiar to somebody out there. This is not the first time Nancy Guthrie's case has drawn attention. But this is one of those moments where the story takes on a different weight, because police are not just asking for tips anymore. They are asking people to look at the words themselves, to read between the lines, to think about who would know what was said, who would know how it was said, and who might recognize the mind behind it. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Tucson area home in early February 2026, and the investigation quickly became one of the most closely watched missing person cases in the country. The FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department treated it as a kidnapping from the start. Authorities said a masked man appeared on doorbell camera footage around the time she vanished. They also said the family was cleared as suspects, and the search began widening almost immediately. That part of the case was already disturbing. But then came the messages. A first email sent the day after Nancy was reported missing was addressed to Savannah Guthrie and demanded millions in Bitcoin. It said Nancy was alive. It said she would be released if payment was made. And it contained details that made investigators stop and take it seriously. The message referenced a white smartwatch found on the bedroom floor. It also mentioned a broken white floodlight in the backyard. Those are not the kind of details a stranger should casually know. And that is part of what made the note so chilling. Because even if someone is trying to fake a kidnapping, the details can still tell you something. They can show how much the writer claims to know. They can show how close they may have been or how carefully they were watching. And before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment with the location you are watching from. The first note already made it feel as though someone had stepped too far into the home itself. But then the second message changed the temperature of the entire case. That later note, sent days after the first, did not demand money. It did not negotiate. It did not promise a release. Instead, it delivered a grim claim that Nancy Guthrie had already died shortly after being taken. It said the writers believed her death was heart-related. It said she was buried in nature now. And it ended with an apology. That is what made it even harder to process, because the tone shifted from threatening to apologetic, from controlling to mournful, from ransom to confession. And that shift is one reason investigators believe the public may be able to help identify the writer. Police say the language in both notes has distinctive patterns, distinctive word choice, distinctive syntax, distinctive phrasing. That doesn't just matter for the case file. It matters because investigators believe those habits might be recognized by somebody who knows the person behind them. Maybe a coworker, a friend, a relative, a former acquaintance. Someone who has heard that voice before, seen that writing style before, or noticed the same kind of language in emails, messages, or notes from the past. That is the angle that makes this story so hard to shake. The public is not being asked to look for a face alone. They are being asked to look for a style, a pattern, a voice hiding in plain sight. And in a case like this, that could be more dangerous than a name, because names can disappear. Patterns tend to repeat. Do you think the notes were written by one person or more than one? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. When investigators released the notes, they were clearly hoping that someone would spot something familiar in the wording, something that feels off, something that sounds like a person they know. That is why the release of these messages matters, not because they solve the case, but because they may expose the kind of person who wrote them. If you are already following this case closely, then you already know the obvious question is no longer only what happened to Nancy, it is also who wrote like this. Because the gap between what the first note demanded and what the second note claimed is not just a difference in tone, it is a difference in intent. The first message tries to control the family through fear. The second tries to close the story before anyone else can. That is what gives this case its strange emotional shape. It is not just a disappearance, it is a narrative struggle. Someone wanted to dictate what happened. Someone wanted to define the ending. And now investigators are trying to pull that ending back open. There is another detail that keeps this case moving in the public eye: the doorbell camera footage. Authorities have said the masked man seen outside the home appeared on different days, which suggests preparation. That detail matters because it changes the picture from a random break-in to something more deliberate. It suggests planning. It suggests surveillance. And it suggests that whoever was involved may have been thinking ahead long before Nancy vanished. That is why investigators continue to ask the public to study the video, the notes, and the behaviour around the time of the disappearance. Not just the obvious things, but the quieter things too. A sudden change in routine, a change in appearance, a strange departure, a new car, a cleaned vehicle, a person who suddenly stops showing up, a person who suddenly sounds different. In many cases, that is how hidden crimes start to unravel. Not through one giant confession, through small things that people remember late. And that is the kind of memory police are hoping to trigger here. The timeline is also important. Nancy was reported missing after disappearing from her home in Tucson in early February. The first note came almost immediately after. The second came a few days later. That means the messages were not written in a vacuum. They arrived while the case was still active, while the search was still beginning, and while the family was still waiting for any sign that she might be found alive. That timing is part of what gives the notes their power. They are not old clues from a cold file drawer. They are early signals from the centre of the case. And now, months later, those same messages are being used in a different way. Not to explain the crime, to expose the writer. The public release of the notes also tells you something about where the investigation stands. It tells you investigators believe there is still value in the language, still value in the wording, still value in the possibility that somebody somewhere recognizes the voice behind them. That is a frustrating kind of progress. It is not the kind that brings immediate closure, but it is the kind that can move a case forward when forensic answers have stalled. And in this case, some of the forensic work has not delivered a clean solution. Early reporting said DNA recovered from the scene was inconclusive. That means the notes, the video, and the public remain crucial. The case has not gone quiet. It has simply become harder. And harder cases often depend on one of two things. Either the science finally breaks open, or a human being remembers something they once ignored. That is why these notes were released now, because investigators are still trying to force that second thing to happen. If somebody reading this has ever seen that kind of language before, or knows someone who started speaking or writing differently around the time Nancy Guthrie disappeared, that could matter more than they realise. A phrase can be enough. A habit can be enough. A message style can be enough. Investigators are betting that the writer did not leave behind a perfect disguise. They are betting that someone will hear the voice and know it. That is the tension at the heart of this update. Not just what the notes say, but what they reveal without meaning to. Because every time a person writes under pressure, a little bit of themselves comes through. The choice of words, the rhythm of the sentences, the way threats are phrased, the way regret is staged. Even the attempt to sound emotionless can become a clue, and that is what makes these messages so haunting. They do not just describe a crime, they leave fingerprints in language. For a case that has already carried months of uncertainty, that may be the most important thing investigators have right now. The family still wants answers. The public is still being asked for help. And the notes are now part of the search for whoever wrote them. Not because they are dramatic, because they may be recognizable, because somebody out there may read them and think, that sounds like him, or that sounds like her, or I have seen this before. That is the opening investigators need, and that is why these messages have been released now. When a case stalls, the smallest detail can become the loudest one. A word choice, a sentence pattern, a strange apology, a threat that sounds rehearsed, a line that sounds too personal to be fake. That is what makes this story so unsettling, even months later. Because the more you stare at the words, the more it feels like the writer was saying more than they intended. And if that is true, then the answer may already be sitting in plain sight. Not in a new witness statement, not in a hidden file, but in the way someone spoke when they thought nobody would ever connect it back to them. That is what police are hoping the public will catch. That is what makes this release important. And that is why this case, even after all this time, still has a pulse. Now, here is the part that keeps this story from ending neatly. The first note tried to turn the disappearance into a transaction. The second tried to turn it into a conclusion. But neither one has closed the case, and that means the real ending is still missing. For investigators, that missing ending may be hiding in a person's memory, a person's habits, or a person's own words. That is why they are still asking for help. That is why the messages matter. And that is why this story is still unfolding. Nancy Guthrie disappeared from her Tucson home in early February 2026, and law enforcement has continued to treat the case as an active kidnapping investigation. The release of these notes is not the end of the search. It is a signal that police believe somebody knows more than they have said. A signal that the wording may matter as much as the crime itself, and a signal that the next breakthrough may come from someone who recognizes a tone they have heard before. A voice like that does not always stay hidden forever. Sometimes it slips, sometimes it repeats itself, and sometimes the thing that gives it away is not a face at all. It is a sentence. It is a phrase. It is the way a person chooses to say what they should never have said in the first place. That is the question hanging over this case now. Who wrote those notes? Who knew enough to make them sound believable? And who, somewhere out there, still recognizes the words well enough to come forward? Because if somebody does, then this story may still have a path to the truth. And until that happens, the notes remain what they are now. A clue, a warning, and possibly the loudest voice left in the entire case.